The galaxy had always been full of strange choices, but none were as shocking as the one made by the great alpha of the predator species. He was a creature feared by many, respected by all, and never questioned by his own kind. Yet one day, he did something no one could understand. Instead of leaving his young cubs in the care of his own warriors or elders, he placed them in the hands of human engineers. The decision spread across the stars like fire. Other alien tribes whispered, laughed, and doubted. Humans? Builders of machines and dreamers of strange ideas, how could they protect cubs of a predator race? Some even called it foolishness, a mistake that would cost the Alpha his legacy. But the Alpha did not care about the noise. His instincts told him something deeper, something only he could feel. He had seen the spark in humans, the way they used their minds rather than claws, the way they built rather than destroyed. He wanted his cubs to know that strength was not only about sharp teeth or powerful roars. The day of departure was filled with tension. The cubs, small yet restless, moved around with wild energy. Their eyes were bright with curiosity, but also with confusion. They did not understand why they were being taken away from the comfort of their homeworld. They looked at the humans, strange beings with soft skin, no claws, and no armor. No, the cubs could not imagine what such fragile-looking creatures could teach them. The humans, however, did not seem afraid. They stood calmly as the Alpha approached, his towering figure casting a long shadow over them. He bent his head, his piercing eyes studying them one by one. Then, with a slow, rumbling voice, he gave them a warning. "These are my cubs. They are wild, they are stubborn, and they are strong. If they fall under your care, it will be your failure. If they rise, it will be your doing. Remember, humans, they carry my blood." The humans did not bow in fear. Instead, one of them stepped forward, speaking softly but firmly. "They will not only rise, they will learn to stand taller than you ever imagined." The Alpha growled low, perhaps in approval, perhaps in doubt. No one could tell. When the time came to leave, the cubs resisted. They clung to the familiar ground of their world, growling and showing their tiny fangs. But the Alpha gave them a single look, the kind of look only a father can give. The cubs froze, then lowered their heads. Without another sound, they followed the humans onto the transport vessel. The ship lifted into the skies, and the homeworld shrank behind them. For the cubs, it was the first step into the unknown. For the humans, it was the beginning of a challenge unlike any other. During the long journey, the cubs sat huddled together, their golden eyes watching everything. They studied the humans with suspicion. They noticed the way the humans checked every system of the ship, the way they worked together with silent signals, the way their hands moved with both speed and precision. The cubs whispered among themselves in their own tongue, wondering what kind of creatures these were. At first, the cubs thought of escape. They were born to be hunters, not students. They scratched at the walls, tested the strength of the doors, and even tried to intimidate the humans with their roars, but the humans never raised a hand in anger. They watched calmly, sometimes even smiling at the cubs' attempts. And when one of the cubs nearly managed to break a panel loose, a human engineer quietly repaired it, stronger than before, and simply said, "You are clever. Let's see if you can build instead of break." The cubs did not understand the words fully, but the tone reached them. It was not fear. It was not weakness. It was something else. Patience. When the ship finally landed on a distant human colony, the cubs were stunned. They had expected cages, perhaps training grounds filled with weapons. But what they saw instead was a place filled with machines, tall structures, and the smell of metal and stone. The colony was alive with the sound of construction. Humans moved everywhere, carrying tools, setting beams, and shaping the world with their hands. The cubs blinked, confused. Where was the battlefield? Where were the warriors to fight? Instead, they saw builders, creators, and dreamers. The youngest cub growled softly, unsure whether to feel disappointed or curious. The humans wasted no time. From the very first day, they began showing the cubs their ways, not through lectures, not through orders, but through actions. They let the cubs walk among the workers, touch the tools, and watch how stone turned into walls, how wood turned into shelters, and how metal turned into strength. At night, when the cubs sat under the stars, they whispered to each other about what they had seen. "They are weak," one said. "They have no claws, no fangs." "But they build," another replied. "They shape the ground like it listens to them. Did you see the tower they made in a single day?" "They are strange," the oldest cub muttered. But father trusted them. "We must learn why." And so the days began to turn into weeks. The cubs still carried their wildness, still tested the humans with growls and sudden jumps. But slowly their eyes began to see differently. They noticed that humans did not run from problems, they solved them. When a storm damaged part of the colony, the humans rebuilt stronger than before. When supplies ran low, they invented new ways to stretch resources. Every challenge became an opportunity, and the cubs could not help but be drawn to that resilience. The departure had not just been about leaving home, it had been about leaving behind old ways of thinking. The cubs were beginning to understand, even if only faintly, that they were stepping into something larger than themselves. They were not just Alpha's cubs anymore. They were students of a species that saw the universe not as something to conquer, but as something to shape. And though the cubs did not yet realize it, their return one day would shake the galaxy to its core. The cubs had never seen anything like it. Back on their home world, they had grown used to mountains, rivers, and the endless plains where their kind hunted. But here, on the human colony, the ground itself was alive with change. Hammers struck, steel machines roared, and sparks flew like fireflies in the air. Everywhere they looked, humans were shaping the land, not with claws or teeth, but with tools and strange machines that seemed to obey them like loyal beasts. At first, the cubs felt out of place. They were hunters by blood. Their instincts told them to stalk, to leap, to fight. Watching humans bend steel into beams and stone into walls felt unnatural. They could not understand why their father had brought them here, to a world where no roars echoed and no hunts began at dawn. But the humans did not push them aside. They welcomed the cubs into the heart of their work. They let the young predators stand near the forges, where heat shimmered in the air and molten metal glowed like rivers of fire. They allowed them to touch the stones freshly cut from the earth, heavy blocks that would soon become part of something larger. And most of all, they showed patience. Patience far greater than the cubs had ever known. One morning, a group of humans led the cubs to a construction site at the edge of the colony. A new fortress wall was being raised, taller and stronger than anything the cubs had seen before. "This," one of the humans explained, speaking in calm tones, "is how we make protection. Not by teeth, not by claws, but by building something that even storms and enemies cannot break." The cubs tilted their heads, confused. To them, strength had always been measured in battles won, in prey hunted, in dominance shown. Yet here was a new kind of strength, one that stood quietly in the form of walls and towers. The youngest cub, restless and bold, reached out and scratched the surface of the half-finished wall. His claws left faint marks, but nothing more. He growled in frustration, expecting the stone to crumble. Instead, the human beside him chuckled softly. Claws leave scars. Stone and steel leave legacies. The cub did not understand the words completely, but he felt the weight behind them. Over the following weeks, the cubs were introduced to more of the human craft. They learned how steel was heated until it bent like clay, then hammered into shapes that served a purpose. They watched bridges rise across rivers, not with natural rock formations, but with beams carefully placed until they carried unimaginable weight. The Cubs began to see that humans did not wait for the world to give them shelter. They carved it with their own hands. At first, the Cubs tried to challenge everything they saw. One day, the oldest cub attempted to break a wooden beam with his strength, showing the humans that his muscles could do what no tool could. The beam cracked, and the cub gave a triumphant growl. But then the humans replaced the broken beam with one reinforced by iron, stronger and steadier than before. The cub's victory was short-lived. Another day, a cub tried to scale the half-built wall, thinking he could outdo the humans' climbing machines. He reached the top, panting with effort, only to find that the humans' cranes had lifted entire loads of stone higher than he could climb in seconds. Slowly, the cubs realized that no matter how strong their bodies were, the humans' creations reached farther. The lessons were not taught with harshness. The humans never mocked, never scolded. Instead, they guided the cubs with gentle firmness. When a cub grew angry after failing to lift a block of stone, a human calmly placed a lever beside him and showed how even the weakest arm could move the heaviest weight with the right tool. The cub's eyes widened, for it was the first time he understood that intelligence could multiply strength. Night after night, the cubs gathered together, whispering about what they had seen. At first, their voices were filled with doubt. "They are fragile," one would say. "If a battle came, they would fall," but another would reply. "Yet their walls would not. Did you see how even the storm broke against them?" "They cannot roar like us," a cub muttered. "No," answered another, "but they build things that roar louder. Did you not hear? The machines!" Slowly, curiosity began to take root. The cubs no longer looked at the humans as prey or weaklings. They began to see them as something different, not stronger in body, but stronger in ways that could last beyond a single fight. 1. Evening, the humans invited the cubs to join in the work, not as spectators, but as helpers. The cubs hesitated at first, unsure if such tasks were beneath them, but when they picked up tools, hammers, chisels, and ropes, something unexpected happened. Their strength, guided by human knowledge, became a force unlike any other. A cub who once broke wood for sport now split stone with purpose. Another who once climbed for pride now carried heavy loads to help raise a tower. The humans encouraged them at every step. "Good," they said, "not just strong, but useful." Those words struck deeper than the cubs expected. They had always been told they were strong. But useful? That was new. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The cubs grew taller, stronger, and sharper. Yet their wildness was slowly tempered by the lessons of steel and stone. They began to see patterns in the work, how every piece fit into a larger design, how every wall was not just for show but for protection, how every tower served as both a watch and a signal. One night, as the cubs sat by a fire, the oldest spoke quietly. "Father wanted us to learn something here, not just how to fight, but how to build." The youngest, still stubborn, growled, "But why? We are predators. Building is not our way." The oldest gazed at the towering walls of the human colony glowing in the firelight. "Maybe he wanted us to see that power is not only in claws or fangs. Power is in what lasts. When we are gone, our hunts will be forgotten. But these walls, these towers, they will stand." The others fell silent, thinking deeply. For the first time, the cubs began to feel the weight of their father's choice. He had not abandoned them. He had given them a gift. The chance to see a different kind of strength. By the time the fortress was finished, the cubs had changed. They still carried the blood of predators, Their roars still shook the air, but their eyes now held something more: vision. They understood that their future would not be measured only in hunts won, but in what they could build, protect, and leave behind. The lessons of steel and stone were no longer just human lessons. They had become part of the Cubs' own spirit, and, though they did not yet know it, these lessons would one day echo across the galaxy, carried by the very Cubs who had once doubted. The Cubs were no longer the same restless beings who had first arrived in the human colony. Weeks had turned into months, and slowly the wildfire inside them had started to shift into something deeper. They still carried the sharpness of hunters, the strength of their kind, but a quiet transformation had begun to take root in their hearts and minds. The change was not sudden. It came in small moments that built upon each other, like drops of water carving paths into stone. A cub would lift a tool instead of using his claws. Another would ask a human to explain how a mechanism worked instead of dismissing it as weakness. Their voices, once filled with doubt and arrogance, began to carry traces of curiosity and respect. One of the first signs of this transformation appeared at the forge. The youngest cub, who had once laughed at the sight of humans sweating over molten steel, now stood beside them for hours. His fur would grow damp from the heat, his eyes fixed on the glowing metal as it bent under careful hands. At first he thought strength alone shaped the steel. But as the human guided his paw to the hammer, he realized it was not brute force but rhythm, patience, and precision that gave the metal its shape. When the blade finally cooled, reflecting the firelight, the cub stared at it in awe. It was not just a weapon. It was proof that strength guided by wisdom could create something lasting. The older cubs also began to change in their own ways. The boldest among them, who once believed walls were cages, now spent long hours studying their structure. He would walk along the stones, tracing the joints with his claws, asking why each block was placed the way it was. A human explained, gently, that every stone carried not only its own weight, but the burden of those above it. If even one piece was placed carelessly, the whole wall could fail. The cub understood then, unity was not weakness, but strength multiplied. Nights became different too. Instead of whispering only of hunts and dominance, the cubs now shared stories of what they had learned during the day. They spoke of the machines that lifted beyond what their muscles could. They marveled at the patterns of bridges and the designs of towers. What once seemed strange now became a language they wanted to learn. Their voices carried not just pride, but wonder. It was during one of these nights that a turning point arrived. A storm swept across the colony, fierce and unrelenting. Winds howled like predators, rain pounded the earth, and thunder split the skies. The cubs remembered storms from their homeworld, storms that could tear trees from the ground. Their instincts told them to seek shelter, to wait it out. But when they looked around, they saw the humans moving with calm determination. They secured the gates, checked the walls, and reinforced the structures. The cubs watched as the storm raged, but the walls stood firm. The towers did not fall. The roofs held against the pounding rain. For the first time, the cubs realized that strength was not about enduring a storm alone. It was about building something together that no storm could break. When the skies finally cleared, the cubs walked through the colony with wide eyes. Every wall, every stone, every beam had protected them. They had felt safe in a way they never had before. From that day onward, their respect for human ways grew stronger. They no longer saw the work of building as dull or unnecessary. Instead, they began to see it as a kind of power, equal to the power of their own muscles and claws. The transformation deepened when the humans trusted them with greater tasks. One morning, the cubs were asked to help design a section of the new fortress. At first, they hesitated. They were used to fighting, not planning. But the humans encouraged them, saying, "Your strength is clear, but now show us your vision." The cubs sat in silence, struggling to imagine what they could add. Then, slowly, they remembered their homeworld. The cliffs where they hunted, the caves where they sheltered, the rivers they crossed. They began to describe shapes that felt natural to them, places where their kind would move with ease. The humans listened carefully and then began sketching. To the cubs' surprise, the designs came alive on parchment, lines, and circles that would soon become stone and steel. For the first time, the cubs saw their instincts merge with human craft. They were not just students anymore. They were creators. This moment stirred something deep within them. They realized that their father's decision to leave them here was not punishment. It was preparation. He had wanted them to see that true strength was not only about survival. It was about shaping the world, protecting it, and leaving behind something greater than themselves. As months passed, their bodies also changed. Once restless and quick to fight, their movements became steadier, more measured. They no longer wasted energy on proving themselves. They worked with purpose. When they carried stones, they did so with pride, knowing each block was part of something larger. When they lifted beams, they no longer roared for attention, but felt satisfaction in seeing the structure rise higher. The humans noticed the change, too. They no longer saw wild cubs, but allies. They began to speak of them not as guests, but as part of the colony. And for the cubs, this acceptance meant more than victory in any battle. For the first time, they belonged to something greater than themselves. But transformation is never without challenge. There were moments when their instincts clashed with their new lessons. One evening, when food ran low, the youngest cub grew impatient. He wanted to hunt, to prove his worth by bringing down prey. But the humans reminded him that patience and planning were also forms of strength. Instead of rushing out, they built traps and prepared carefully. The cub watched as the traps captured food with efficiency that even his claws could not match. It humbled him, yet it also taught him that instinct alone was not enough. Another challenge came when arguments rose among the cubs themselves. Some still longed for the life of the hunt, the thrill of dominance. Others were drawn deeper into the world of building and planning. Their voices clashed, sometimes with anger. But the humans guided them gently, showing them that disagreement was not the end. Just like stones in a wall, each cub's perspective had value, and when placed correctly, they formed something unbreakable. By the end of that year, the transformation was undeniable. The cubs who had once mocked walls now stood proudly beside them. They who once scoffed at tools now crafted weapons and structures with their own paws. They who once saw humans as fragile now saw them as teachers, partners, and in some ways, equals. On the night of the harvest festival, the cubs sat among the humans, sharing food, laughter, and stories. For the first time, there was no division between them. The cubs looked at the glowing lights of the fortress they had helped build and felt a sense of pride that was deeper than any hunt. They were no longer just predators. They were builders, dreamers, protectors. The transformation had begun quietly, almost invisibly, but now it was clear to all. The cubs were no longer simply the children of a fierce leader. They were becoming something new, something that would carry the lessons of steel and stone into the future. And though they did not yet know it, this transformation would shape not only their lives, but the destiny of their entire kind. The day of return did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, like the first light of dawn spreading across the land. The cubs had spent long months with the humans, learning, working, building, and changing. They had become something different from when they first arrived, stronger not just in muscle, but in spirit, patience, and wisdom. But now the time had come. The call from their own kind was clear. Their father, the alpha who had left them behind, was waiting. He had given them time to grow, and now the moment had arrived for them to step back into his world. The cubs felt both excitement and a deep heaviness in their hearts. Leaving the human colony meant leaving behind the teachers who had shaped them, the walls they had helped build, and the strange sense of belonging they had discovered. The night before their departure, the colony gathered in the square. Fires burned bright, throwing warm light over stone walls and towers. Humans and cubs sat side by side, eating from the same plates, sharing laughter and exchanging memories. The air was filled with both joy and sadness. No one spoke of goodbye, but everyone felt it. One of the cubs, the boldest of the group, stood and looked around at the humans. His voice, once sharp and proud, now carried calm strength. He said that when they first arrived, they believed walls were cages and tools were weaknesses. But now they understood that walls were protection and tools were power. He promised that these lessons would not be forgotten. His words made many eyes grow wet with emotion, for the humans had also grown close to the cubs. At dawn, the journey began. The cubs walked side by side, their paws heavy against the earth. Behind them, the humans stood along the walls, watching. They raised their hands in farewell, and though no words were spoken, the silence carried deep meaning. The cubs looked back one last time, their hearts filled with gratitude. Then they turned toward the horizon, toward the world that awaited them. The path home was not easy. They crossed rivers swollen by rain, climbed ridges sharp with stone, and traveled through forests thick with shadow. Yet the journey felt different now. Where once they might have rushed forward impatiently, they now moved with careful rhythm. They built shelters at night instead of curling beneath branches. They stored food instead of hunting recklessly each day. Every choice showed how far they had come. When they finally reached the land of their people, the air carried a familiar scent. It was the smell of wild earth, untamed rivers, and the strength of their kind. From a distance, they could see the gathering of their kin, hundreds of strong figures standing tall, waiting for them. At the center, the Alpha stood. His presence was as commanding as ever, his eyes sharp, his form unshaken by time. The cubs felt their hearts pound. This was the moment they had been preparing for. They walked forward slowly, not as children but as beings transformed. The crowd of their kind whispered among themselves, surprised at what they saw. The cubs were still the same in shape and blood, yet there was something different about the way they carried themselves. Their steps were steady, their gaze unbroken, their silence powerful. The Alpha spoke, his voice deep as thunder. He asked what they had learned, what they had become. For a moment, no cub answered. Then one stepped forward and raised a paw, not in challenge but in respect. He said they had learned that strength alone was not enough, that walls, tools, and unity gave power that claws could not. He said storms could be faced not only by fangs, but by what was built with patience and wisdom. The Alpha's eyes narrowed, testing their words. He demanded proof, not with a fight, but with action. He led them to a valley where their kind often sheltered. It was open and exposed, easy for storms to tear apart and enemies to invade. He asked what they would do to protect it. The cubs looked at one another, and without hesitation, they began to work. They remembered every lesson from the humans. They gathered stones, placed them with care, and raised walls that curved with the land. They dug trenches to guide water away, set beams that could hold weight, and designed paths where their kind could move quickly in defense. Day after day they worked, and their kin watched in silence. Slowly, a fortress began to rise where there had once been only open ground. It was not only strong, it was alive with design, shaped by both instinct and learning. The cubs did not argue or compete for dominance. They moved with unity, each one adding his strength to the whole. When it was finished, the valley stood transformed. Walls embraced it, towers rose high, and gates stood firm. The Alpha walked among the stones, running his claws along the walls. He looked at the cubs and saw not children, but leaders. His silence was long, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried pride. He declared that they had returned not only as his blood, but as builders of a new strength. The crowd of their kind roared with approval. For the first time they saw that power was not only in the hunt or the fight, it could also be found in creation, in building something that could last beyond a single lifetime. The Cubs had not just returned. They had brought back knowledge that could shape the future of their people. That night, fires burned high and songs filled the air. The Cubs sat together, watching the flames dance. They remembered the human colony, the teachers, the laughter, the walls they had built. They knew they would never forget. They carried those lessons now, not as memories, but as part of themselves. In their hearts, they understood something deeper. The return was not an ending. It was a beginning. They had crossed from cubs to something greater, and now their journey would continue. Their kind would change, slowly, as they had. The strength of claws would remain, but now it would stand beside the strength of steel and stone. As the stars spread across the sky, the cubs lifted their eyes. Somewhere far beyond those stars, the humans still lived, still built, still dreamed. The bond between them would not fade, even if they never met again. The cubs had returned, but they carried two worlds within them now, the wild strength of their kind and the enduring craft of humankind. And in that balance, they knew, lay the true meaning of strength. The days after the Cubs' return were filled with change. At first, their people only admired the new fortress they had built, running their paws along the stone, amazed at its strength. But soon, they began to see something even greater. They saw that the Cubs had brought back not only walls of stone, but also ideas that could last for generations. What had started as a journey of growth had become the beginning of a new way of life. The Alpha watched closely. He had always believed in strength, in the power of fangs and claws, in the dominance of the strongest. But now, as he walked through the valley, seeing the fortress standing tall against wind and rain, he understood something new. His cubs had returned with more than muscle. They had returned with vision, and vision could outlast even the strongest warrior. Slowly, the elders and hunters of the tribe gathered to ask questions. They wanted to know how the cubs had learned such skills. The cubs spoke of the humans, how they lived in communities, how they planned together, and how they built not for themselves alone, but for all. They explained how the humans used their minds as much as their bodies, how they turned weakness into strength by working side by side. Some of the tribe doubted. They whispered that humans were fragile, too soft, too dependent on walls and tools. But the cubs answered calmly. They said fragility was not weakness. It was what made humans wise enough to build strength that could last. They said claws could defend, but stone could endure. And slowly, their people began to listen. The fortress became more than a shelter. It became a school. The cubs showed others how to shape stone, how to lift beams together, how to carve patterns into the land so water and wind would serve them instead of fight them. Younger ones watched with wide eyes, eager to learn. Even the elders, who had always relied on tradition, began to see value in these new ways. As weeks passed, more fortresses rose, not as large or perfect as the first, but strong enough to change the way their people lived. No longer did they wander restlessly, always searching for safe ground. Now they could settle, raise their young in protection, and face storms without fear. The land itself began to change under their hands, shaped not only by nature but by design. The Alpha, who had once been skeptical, now stood proud. He declared that his cubs had brought back a gift greater than prey or land. They had brought knowledge. And knowledge, he said, was the sharpest weapon of all. His words echoed across the gathering, and his people roared in agreement. But the cubs, now grown, did not forget the humans. Often, at night, they would look up at the stars and remember the colony, the laughter, the lessons, the fire-lit evenings, spent side by side. They knew they might never see them again, yet the bond remained alive. The fortress walls carried the memory of those who had first taught them how to build. Every stone was a reminder. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, the boldest of the cubs spoke quietly to his kin. He said their story was not just about survival anymore. It was about creating a new path, one that honored both their wild strength and the wisdom they had learned. He said they must teach their people not only how to fight, but how to build, how to dream, how to shape the future. And so, a new tradition began. Each season, the cubs would lead groups of their kind to new valleys, new riversides, new hills. Together, they would raise walls and towers, not just to protect, but to unite. Slowly, their people spread further and grew stronger, not through endless battle, but through creation. For the first time, they thought of the future not as something to fear, but as something they could design. The Alpha grew older, but his pride never faded. He often sat at the edge of the fortress, watching the young ones carry stones and set them in place. He saw in them the same spark that his cubs had returned with, and he knew that this legacy would outlive him. When his time finally came to an end, he left with peace in his heart, knowing his cubs had given their people a new strength, one that would not fade with his passing. The cubs, now leaders themselves, carried on his spirit. They no longer thought of themselves as only hunters or fighters. They were builders, teachers, and guardians of a new way. They had taken what humans gave them and shaped it into something uniquely their own. A blend of wild power and crafted wisdom. Generations passed, and stories spread. Elders told the tale of the time when the cubs had left as children and returned as visionaries. They spoke of the humans who had shown them a different kind of strength. Around firelight, young ones listened with shining eyes, imagining distant worlds and faraway stars. The story became not just history but legend, a reminder that even the fiercest could learn, and even the strongest could grow. And beyond the stars, in the human colony far away, there were also stories told. The humans remembered the cubs with warmth. They spoke of the wild companions who had once lived among them, who had learned their ways and carried them back to their own kind. They knew they might never see them again, yet they believed the bond was eternal. For in every wall they built, in every tower they raised, they imagined the cubs doing the same under distant skies. In time, the two peoples became part of each other's stories, not enemies, not strangers, but partners in spirit. The humans had given lessons of steel and stone. The cubs had returned those lessons with strength and heart. Together, they had created something greater than either could alone. The legacy lived not only in walls or fortresses, but in memory, in hope, in the simple truth that even the most unlikely beings could share a future. The Cubs' journey had started with departure, grown through hardship, transformed in lessons, and ended in return. But their true gift was not what they brought back. It was what they left behind for those yet to come. And so, under the endless sky, among stars that linked two worlds, a new legacy was born. A legacy not of fear or dominance, but of unity, strength, and the power of building something that lasts.